Hello, everyone, and welcome back to PSF 401 Political Behavior. This week, we're looking at congressional elections and specifically trying to answer the question why congressional elections differ from presidential elections. But first, we need to discuss the notion of a correct vote. So, in much of the prevailing literature, a correct vote is considered to be what an individual would do if they had perfect information, or otherwise, if they precisely calculated the results of electing one candidate over another, and which result would be preferable based on their personal desires. Now, in Joseph and Stone, as well as many others, this is the candidate that is closer to the voter. This is the proximity model of voting here. Now, much of this week's readings, as well as in previous weeks, deals with the question, to what extent is the public casting imperfect or perfect votes? Pretty much unanimously, no one argues that the American public casts perfect votes. So the idea here is, to what extent is the public casting imperfect votes? Now, the voter themselves, or voters in general, does not have perfect information. And this is particularly true in congressional elections. And so we have to ask the question then, what are the implications of this on our models of vote choice? Fundamentally, in congressional elections in particular, voters have less information, the candidates have lower name recognition, and there is a reduced or lack of assurance about the eventual policy results, not only because the voters just can't be sure about what a candidate or what a politician will do if they are elected, but also because that senator or that congressperson has a very much less influential role over policy than compared to the president, by dint of the fact that they are one of 400 and one of 435 or one of 100. They are not singularly responsible for the resulting policy, and thus that complicates the decision to any particular voter. Now, so in terms of the implications here, we also need to differentiate between House and Senate races. Senate races are much more high profile, they're much more expensive, they have a lot more media recognition, and so information in Senate races as compared to House races is much higher. And therefore, everything we're about to talk about today applies doubly so to House races as compared to Senate races. Now, the main factors in determining congressional vote choice, described not only by the literature that we're covering this week, but just generally, tend to be partisanship, incumbency, and specifically their name recognition, as well as presidential approval. These are the main factors when we're considering how an individual is going to vote in a congressional election. And so before we get into the readings here, I'm not going to start with the required reading. I'm first going to discuss the two choice readings and then close with a discussion of the required reading. So our first choice reading here, Carson and Jacobson, they focus on three main factors in predicting, or a better way to say that would be accounting for congressional vote choice. These are partisanship, incumbency, and name recognition. The authors here argue that partisanship is still dominant, and that incumbency in particular has been waning in importance since the 1980s. Congressional elections themselves are lower information. Many voters don't know one or both of the candidates' names even entering into the ballot box. And therefore, individual voters rely very heavily on partisanship. But that's not the whole story. That's not the full story. When we look at congressional elections, incumbents have a much higher percentage or a much greater chance of being reelected than do challengers do at being elected for the first time. In part, this is due to many of the inbuilt advantages that incumbents have as compared to challengers. One of these is that incumbents are much more well-known. They have much greater name recognition. But it's not all name recognition. Constituent contacts, what we sometimes refer to as constituent service, is very important. And this is particularly true where the incumbent meets with their constituents in person. If someone has actually met their congress member or met their senator, they're much more likely to remember meeting them and much more likely to vote for someone that they have actually shaken the hand of, for example. In general, though, even beyond incumbency service or meeting someone, people are generally more favorable towards incumbents than they are negative. And it's not all, go with the devil that you know. Unless the incumbent is truly bumbling, is truly incompetent, people tend to respect and appreciate that someone is their representative. And even if they have a negative view towards Congress as whole, if someone is going to Washington, is representing you, at least nominally representing your interests, that kind of behavior is very likely to elicit a positive emotional response. This article here, I should say, this chapter from Carson and Jacobson is very interesting. But perhaps my favorite quote from this week, and somewhat funny, is where they say, voters are, in fact, often willing to offer opinions about candidates, incumbents and challengers alike, even without remembering their names. That's a funny statement, a funny observation about political behavior in the United States, that voters don't necessarily need any information in order to offer an opinion, much less cast their votes. Somewhat humorous on the surface here. But this actually is a somewhat deep observation about American politics. There's no constitutional or otherwise legal requirements for you to be a well-informed and knowledgeable voter entering into the ballot box. In these kind of low information environments, very often individuals will revert to partisanship simply as a means of, let's call it a heuristic. You generally know largely what the party stands for and can make reasonable guesses as to what that party is going to do if elected or if in control of government there. But even a little bit deeper than that, there can be a baseline orientation towards what we might call the status quo. Have things been going well, or have things been going not well? And to what extent does the voter attribute the current state of affairs to their individual representative or to their individual senator? If an individual has no other information other than a generalized sense of unease or malaise or otherwise dissatisfaction with the current state of government, they're much more likely to vote for the non-incumbent or otherwise vote for the challenger, regardless of partisan identification, regardless of any other information about that given race. Political behavior and elections generally, it's difficult to say, and as we'll refer to at the end, or as I'll return to at the end, it's difficult to say that individuals are casting their ballots with perfect information. Very often, it's this kind of general feeling or general desire for change or generalized satisfaction with the status quo. Moving now to the Arnold chapter here, this is kind of a shift towards the other side of the coin. The Arnold here basically is looking at this vote decision criteria from the legislator or from the politician's point of view, a more legislative-centric point of view and view of congressional elections generally. And he looks at the decisions of Congress members themselves. Arnold first describes here, or first defines here, what he refers to as the attentive and inattentive public. As the names imply here, the attentive public cares very deeply about policy matters and has discrete and well-defined policy demands of Congress members when entering into the ballot box. And as a result of that, they will either reward or they will sanction members of Congress based on their previous ability to fulfill those policy demands or their future likelihood of fulfilling those policy demands. On the other hand, there is the inattentive public. And as described by Arnold, these are individuals that may have opinions that register in public surveys when they are asked fixed choice questions, but there can be no assurance that their answers reflect politically relevant attitudes. Such opinions are notoriously unstable, fluctuating with even slight changes in question wording or with the ebb and flow of events. Continuing, legislators ignore inattentive publics at their peril. Fundamentally here, the inattentive public is the vast majority of the public. Think about if you were presented with a survey, someone asking you questions about specific policy items. there may be an option for you not to respond at all, right? Say, I refuse to answer that, or none of the above, whatever it might be. But most people are going to offer some degree of opinion on whatever that question might be it a policy question. What is the preferred marginal tax rate? Or what should the capital gains tax rate be? Should there be greater support for universal health care by the federal government? Things of that nature. Even if prior to being presented with that survey question, this is not something that the individual would have given any time of day to, any thought to whatsoever, when presented with that question, they are going to formulate an opinion. The way that the question is formulated matters, the time, the circumstances of their life matter, what's going on in current events also matter. This is where, when Arnold describes this as notoriously unstable, fluctuating with even slight changes in question wording, right, this is what they are talking to. The inattentive public fundamentally is not reliable, right? They can be mobilized in one direction or another. Current events, unforeseen circumstances can fundamentally change how the inattentive public is evaluating legislators. And because of this uncertainty, legislators actually give a greater attention to the attentive public, as they at least have discrete and well-defined criteria upon which they are evaluating legislators. Legislators within this context are going to say, okay, it may be 10% of the public, but A, they're very likely to vote, and also very likely to vote in primary elections, and B, at least that's something that I can fulfill. At least those desires are something that I can fulfill in a meaningful way. Legislators also give considerable consideration to retrospective voting, but not in the sense of like specific policy items, but rather what Arnold describes here as the kind of positive and negative orientations, or popular or unpopular policy items. He terms the politically compelling policies as popular, and politically repellent options are policies that are either unpopular or generally misunderstood or not well understood by the public generally. And thus, returning to the decision-making criteria of the legislators, what are they doing, or what is governing their behaviors when in office? They basically need to consider both positions as well as the effects of those positions, as well as the kind of knowns and unknowns of public preferences. As Arnold describes, all else equals, legislators follow the preferences of those who feel most intensely about an issue. However, it's important to note that Congress members are not naively calculating on each potential issue for each vote in their respective chamber. They've already been elected or re-elected multiple times. They have a pretty good feel for the preferences of their constituents. The truly dangerous aspect to these incumbents, or to these legislators, is the mobilization of the inattentive public by a political entrepreneur, usually a challenger, reorienting or reframing the political discourse in a way that is difficult to defend. But because this is kind of an unforeseen or unknowable future event, legislators actually can't give a tremendous amount of time towards these events. Instead, they do the best that they can. Moreover here, it's important to note that these kind of political entrepreneurs are actually more common at the primary stage as opposed to the general election stage. The Democratic or Republican challenger is going to be a much more well-known quantity and going to engage with politics in a much more well-known way. And therefore, the real dangerous process, as described in the week that we spent on primary elections, for many of these Congress members are actually primary challengers here. So keeping these things in mind, this brings us to this week's required reading, Jostin and Stone. Jostin and Stone fundamentally argue that partisanship and presidential approval, along with a couple other things, function pretty well to emulate what we might term proximity voting, or those correct votes, thus reaffirming the kind of spatial or proximity voting school of thought in terms of its legitimacy here. First thing to note is that Jostin and Stone were published in 2014. Bartels was published in 1996. Bartels is as you read, very skeptical of these type of explanations. And American politics and American society had evolved over those 2 decades. During this time period, we saw the partisan sort, the Lewandowski partisan sort, where the parties became more ideologically coherent. We saw political polarization, as well as the proliferation of information through the internet. It may be the case that both Bartels and Jostin and Stone are correct. Their observations were simply made at different times. It also may be the case that this disagreement between the two works was largely due to measurement differences, as Arnold and Jostin and Stone measure things quite differently. However, the authors here argue that people still meaningfully can't place candidates on an ideological scale, basically supporting what Bartels was saying in 1996. Fundamentally, congressional voters do well enough or do good enough based on the heuristics of partisanship and presidential approval, as well as some interpersonal networks and other contextual factors here. How does this square with Arnold? How does this square with Carson and Jacobson? Fundamentally, the ideal type of democratic government requires a well-informed and active public to soberly evaluate the policy and otherwise political preferences and vote for the candidates that most accurately represent those preferences. Carson and Jacobson don't think this is happening. Arnold argues that the quality of governance itself, the behavior of legislators, is fundamentally undermined because that's not what's occurring. Even going back a few weeks here, Bartels, Healy, and Malhotra, even Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes, they don't think that's what's occurring. Even Jostin and Stone don't think that's what's happening here. They, as well as others, argue that heuristics, through stable partisan offerings and through fundamentally political inertia, that the American electorate muddles through imperfectly. And as compared to presidential elections, which are high information, high profile events, many Americans now, even today, going into the ballot box in those midterm elections or casting their ballot for members of Congress do so imperfectly, do so as the result of heuristics, of bias, of otherwise skewed sources of information that fundamentally undermine the kind of connection that would be required through the ideal type of democracy. But it's not all doom and gloom. As Jostin and Stone argue, the American public does pretty well with this, even with imperfect information, even with those biases, and even as a result of relying on those heuristics. So congressional elections, fundamentally different than presidential elections? Perhaps not, but very much different in terms of the type of information and the decision-making or vote decision-making criteria that the American public uses. So that's all I have for you today. A reminder that your next reading analyses are due this Sunday. So as always, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. We're getting very close to the end of the semester, so be sure to push through to the end. As always, enjoy the rest of your week.